IVM.
Hi, everybody. Just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. Today we are discussing a topic called as sports diplomacy. And to discuss this with us, I have with me Arjun, who is also a research analyst at Takshashila. Now, before Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy, and we have education programs that last one semester or 1 year, and these are tailored specifically for people like you. And these are online, and you can take them from anywhere. We have admissions open for our 12-week graduate certificate programs in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology and policy, and health and life sciences. And we also have an opening for a postgraduate program in public policy. And these programs begin from 15th January 2022. And the last date for application to avail 10% early bird scholarship is 4th December 2021. And the application deadlines are on 8th December 2022. You can visit school.takshashila.org.in to find out more. So, to begin with our episode, the concept of politics and diplomacy through sports has been around for a very long time. And there have been recent signs that have also been seen in the ongoing T20 World Cup, where teams have been asked to take the knee to end racism in support of the recent BLM movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. But what is interesting is that there are multiple occasions of political movements affecting the sporting events and an detailed history behind the intersection of sports, diplomacy, and politics. Now, to take us through this journey, like I said before, I have with me Arjun, and who has read extensively about this topic and would like to share knowledge about this with us. So, to begin with, Arjun, from when was the concept of politics seen in sports? And is there a particular sporting event which has been like a hallmark of posturing?
Hey Priyal, thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, being an avid sports fan, I wanted to combine my love for sports and the love for politics and diplomacy and see what actually I can find. And I found quite a bit of stuff. As you said, it's been around for a pretty long time. And it can date back to the early 1900s. It was more or less used as a way to further your propaganda and your ideology. So a particular sporting event, which is kind of the hallmark for political posturing, should be the Olympics. I mean, that is the greatest sporting event in the world. You have countries from all across the world coming together, participating in one event. So if you go back all the way to 1936, there was the Olympic Games, which was held in Berlin, and this was during the time when Hitler was in power. He was the Führer, and he managed to get the Olympics to Germany at that point of time. And it was very interesting to know that Hitler kind of used the Olympics to pursue his theory of Nazism and racial propaganda, wherein he wanted to assert the supremacy of the Aryans, or whatever he called the better race. So in that way, he had predicted that only the whites and the Germans would end up winning the most medals at the Olympics. And there's this one photo of Jesse Owens, the black sprinter from America, who had won multiple track and field events in 1936, standing on the podium with all the others all the other German officials giving the Nazi salute. It's kind of ironic to see that. So it can date back all the way till then. And from then, there has been a lot of instances at the Olympics where we can see political posturing and statements being made. So in 1968, which was very famous for the Black Power salute. So this was during the height of the civil rights movement in the United States of America. So there was Martin Luther King, and the civil rights movement had taken on a new kind of image across the world. And there were these two athletes, Tommy Smith and one more, which I kind of forgot his name. So these guys had won an event at the 1968 Olympics, and they went on the podium, and while receiving their medals, they clenched their fist and raised it in the air, which was basically the Black Power salute. So that was to kind of signal the oppression which was faced by the African Americans back home in their country. So in the same Olympics, this was 1968, right? So in the same Olympics, there was this Czechoslovak. She was an athlete. She was a gymnast, I guess. So this was the year of the Prague Spring. So the year when the Soviet Union decided to attack Czechoslovakia and suppress the rebellion in the country. So when she won the event, she also walked away from this anthem when it was playing as a sign of her response to the Soviets attacking her country. So that was one more sign which was seen. But I guess the most prominent thing which was seen was during the 1972 games. This was held in Munich, and it was 5 years after the 1967 Six-Day War, which between Israel and the Arab countries, and which Israel had won phenomenally, and they had gained a lot of territory. So the Arab countries were on the back foot. There was increasing resentment towards Israelis, and this resulted in an organization called as Black September. Those guys eventually ended up coming into the Olympic Games village and kidnapping Israeli athletes and holding them hostage. So this was something which had not been seen across the world ever before, and that happened right under the noses of the Olympic Committee itself. So it was something that no one expected, and the worst part was they ended up killing and murdering all these Israeli athletes in retaliation for Israel's sort of humiliating victory over the Arab countries. So that was something which was seen in 1972, which you can also see something in 1988, wherein North Korea kind of had terrorist attacks on the south because this Seoul was hosting their games that year, and they wanted to kind of assert their presence in the in the global diplomacy world. So and wherein they were kind of shunned away and they weren't allowed to host the game, so they kind of retaliated through terrorist attacks and across the north and south border. But the most recent one I think everyone would remember was what happened this year, just basically this year's Olympic Games, when this Belarusian athlete decided to not go back to Belarus and condemn Lukashenko's regime. So the Olympics kind of has been the event for the intersection of politics and sports and kind of making political statements on the international stage. So yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see that as we move forward in this decade and the next decade and so on.
Yeah, so basically, like, Olympics is like it has multiple sports in it, right? But have there been any events in other sports which have acted as like potential diplomatic tools for states? And like, if there are certain events, like, what is the story behind such events?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. There are a lot of sports which have acted as both diplomatic tools and as kind of the aggressors for war. So if you think about, if you can even think about a football match causing an all-out war between two countries, no one would actually think about that, but that happened all the way back in 1970 between El Salvador and Honduras. So they had a border dispute, and there was increasing smuggling across each other's borders, and there were the cartels running drug mafias, and resulting in the deaths of many citizens across each border. So they blamed each other for the whatever is happening. And in 1970, they were supposed to play a football game. The first leg was in Honduras. When the football match happened, there was riots, and it ended up in large-scale riots and kind of causing a proxy war between the two countries. So that was something that even I found surprising, because a game of sport has always kind of brought two countries together rather than divided them apart. So yeah, specifically as diplomatic tools, there's one instance which I think everyone would kind of might have heard about, especially if you're into Chinese history. So this was at the height of the Cold War. The relations between China and the Soviet Union had kind of deteriorated in the 1960s after Stalin's death. And after the Sino-Soviet split, there was this courting by the United States. They were trying to establish diplomatic back channels with China. They tried to use Pakistan as a mediator between the two countries, but yeah, that did not materialize. And eventually, I think in 1972, there was this very interesting thing where the Chinese gave an all expense paid trip invitation to the United States table tennis team, ping pong team. So that was the first ever kind of relations between China and the US in the post World War II era. So that kind of led to a chain reaction, and after which Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State, kind of went in on a secret trip to China without anyone knowing, and finally Richard Nixon ended up traveling to China and becoming the first US president to do so. So, what we now know as ping pong diplomacy, it kind of shaped the world order as we know today, because at that time there was huge tensions between the United States and Soviet Union, and China was still an emerging player, and that kind of shaped 2, 3, 4 decades of world politics. Other than that, of course, speaking about sports diplomacy, one cannot ignore India and Pakistan. It's kind of the thing which all Indians would know, because relations between two countries have kind of always been on a high and low basis, and every time it's gone very low, they've used sports as a mechanism to kind of get back on the right track. This was actually kind of seen in 2011, in the 2011 Cricket World Cup, when India and Pakistan played in the semi-finals, and this was held in Punjab, Mohali, and the two prime ministers visited the game, and they watched it together. This was the first meeting between the two prime ministers after 26/11 attacks. So that was kind of their way of saying, let's move past it, type of diplomacy. But again, everyone knows this story, but this was not the first kind of diplomatic relations courting between India and Pakistan after 26/11. So after 26/11, I think in the 2010 US Open, Rohan Bopanna and Assam Ul Qureshi, they were playing doubles together, and they were called as the Indo-Pak Express, and they ended up reaching the US Open final in men's doubles in that year. So this kind of created a lot of unity between the two countries. They were cheering the team on, and the US Open is held in New York, which is the headquarters of the United Nations. So um, the ambassadors of both the countries to the UN actually visited actually attended the final and visited stadium to support the team, and they ended up sitting next to each other and giving out statements saying this is what brings India and Pakistan together, and unity through sports and stuff like that. So in that way, sports and sporting events have actually shaped diplomatic relations between countries, and kind of established or reinvigorated some relations, and also deteriorated some diplomatic relations.
That is actually very interesting, especially the India Pakistan one that you mentioned about the after 26/11, and the fact that there were the tennis players who were one from India and one from Pakistan. So that was actually very interesting. But before we continue, we would like to take a short break and we will be right back.
Your computer can be compromised in many ways, and all cyber attacks ultimately affect your files and apps by accessing everything that's on your PC. Intel vPro keeps you safe from cyber attacks using the Intel Hardware Shield, which has 3 groups of capabilities. First, advanced threat protection, quickly detecting issues like ransomware and crypto mining. Second, below the OS security, identifying unauthorized changes to hardware. And lastly, application and data protection, preventing malware injections. So, secure your organization's productivity with Intel vPro's hardware-based security. Visit intel.in/IT heroes to know more. Remember, Intel vPro is built for business.
Welcome back, and continuing with this conversation of sports diplomacy. From our previous conversation, we know that sports has played an important and integral part in like politics and diplomacy, and sports has been used as a potential tool. Now, Arjun, can you tell me if have there been any major political events which have affected these sporting events, and like certain countries in particular, and if they have, like how have these countries managed to respond to this?
Yeah, I mean, in if you're talking about certain political events which have affected sports across the world, there are quite a few. I mean, if I have to think of the top of my head, in 2011 in Bahrain, this was at the height of the Arab Spring movement, wherein there were a lot of protests happening across the Middle East, especially against dictators and dictatorial regimes. And there was also an uprising in Bahrain, and that year it was the Formula One race was supposed to be held in the country, but the teams and the sponsors and everyone refused to go to the race, and it eventually was cancelled due to strict protocols and the tensions between the government and the citizens in the country. So in that year, the whole race was actually cancelled, and no one actually wanted to take a risk with that. And if you talk about specific countries itself, I think everyone would know about. How South Africa, especially, was kind of boycotted and was made a pariah in the sporting world, especially due to their apartheid regime. This was all the way from, I guess, 1960s, 1970s till the 1990s. So, due to their oppressive nature of the blacks and how there was racism speak in the country, every sporting body, almost every international sporting body, decided to ban South Africa from competing in its own games, in different sports basically. And this kind of had a huge impact on the country itself. So they were again ostracized, and finally, eventually, they were let into other sporting events or in the 90s. This was seen very much, especially in the 1994 World Rugby World Cup. So this was the year that South Africa was actually given the hosting rights, and it marked their entry into the World Cup. And Nelson Mandela had just become the president of the country, and he wanted the rugby team to be the unifiers for the entire South African society. So there's this movie also called Invictus, wherein Morgan Freeman plays Nelson Mandela and Matt Damon plays the captain of the South African rugby team. So they showcase how Mandela was actually very interested in learning about the game, in visiting the team and encouraging the team to do well. And eventually the team ended up winning the World Cup in 94, and that was a huge morale booster for the entire country, which was just coming out of the apartheid regime. So in that way it kind of brought South Africa back into the international sporting arena, from which it was absent for almost 2 to 3 decades. And other countries can, if I have to talk about other countries, Israel is one of the countries which has seen a lot of these ostracization and political events which are kind of affected their own sporting athletes. So many athletes from Israel was actually boycotted by the AFC countries. So AFC is that thing about the Asian Football mm, Confederation. So many countries in Asia, they decided to boycott Israel's entry into the AFC, and eventually Israel had to end up joining the UEFA, which is the European Confederation for the football nations. So in that way, they were not allowed to be a part of AFC, even though they're part of Asia. So in that way, Israel was kind of bore the brunt of politics and political events. There were also many athletes from Israel, like in especially in tennis, when some of them were actually not allowed to compete in Dubai and Qatar. So these tennis players were, even though they were international tennis players who had quite a bit of reputation in the game, they weren't allowed to come and compete in the tournaments held in these countries, mainly because of the he- the heated rivalry between Israel and these Arab countries. So in that way, countries have actually bore the brunt, and the countries' sports teams have bore the brunt of political events and political. Basically politics, especially what is seen now also in Afghanistan after the Taliban took over. So there was this one photo of the Afghan women's football team who had managed to flee Afghanistan, and they were in another country, and they were trying to get rally support and eventually end up kind of becoming the torchbearers for Afghan unity. So in that way, many sports and many sporting legends have been excluded from the games due to their politics and the diplomatic relations between countries. I guess this is a way of just political posturing, but it serves a huge message to the country, saying that if this continues, you might have to face more bans from other sporting events and stuff like that. So I guess in that way, sports and politics and diplomacy and everything is just tied together at the end of the day.
Yeah, this is actually very, very interesting. Thank you so much, Arjun, for joining me and giving me and the listeners such a broad and in depth information about how sports is closely connected with diplomacy and politics and how it can be utilized to establish relations but also sort of protest against certain things. This has been a very informative conversation. Thank you so much for joining me, Arjun. And all the listeners, thank you so much for joining us, listening to us, and stay tuned for more episodes coming up. Thank you.
Thanks, Priyal. See you guys.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hello, everybody. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. An app for extramarital relationships sounds interesting? Well, it exists, and it's booming. On GBCD, Farad and Sunetru talked to Sybil Shidel from Gleeden, a dating service primarily marketed to women. On Simplified, the gang discussed the phenomena of sports washing illustrated by the recent Saudi takeover of the Newcastle United Football Club. On the Life Manifesto, Serena explains various lessons from Charlie Plum's life and how we can apply them to our own lives. On Say No to Drama, Chetna is here to slice the drama around workaholics and help understand the consequences of our choices. And learn how to simplify your personal finances on Paisa Vaisa as Anupam speaks to co-founders of 5Money, Sujit Narayan and Sumit Golani. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week: Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quarter, CoinSwitch, Kuber, Slay Coffee, Intel, Kotak Mahindra Bank, and Oxfam India. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Whether you're an established sports person or a budding one, or simply a sports enthusiast, join us, Tanvi and Shlok.
We are two passionate pro badminton players talking policy, mindset and everything sport.
So tune in to the Millennial Athlete every Monday.
Only on the IVM Podcast Network.
Trust us, it's gonna be lit.